profound transition is currently unfolding within the royal family. Catherine has been recognized for her unwavering public service, stepping into an elevated position that acknowledges her steadfast dedication. It is certain she will approach these new demands with the same resolute duty that has become her hallmark. This declaration did not emerge amidst fanfare, scandal, or uproar. Instead, it was delivered with the chilling, absolute authority intrinsic to the palace machinery. In a matter of moments, Catherine's standing within the royal institution was permanently altered. Following years defined by patience, rigorous training, health battles, intense observation, and quiet anticipation, the Princess of Wales was officially advanced toward the most fiercely protected and desired role for any woman in the firm, the future Queen of Britain. Yet beneath the meticulously crafted public statement lay a reality far more poignant and complex than the world initially grasped. Before we explore the profound implications this holds for the entire monarchy, please take a moment to subscribe so you never miss our ongoing coverage. Upon receiving the final draft of the proclamation, Catherine absorbed the words twice over before gently placing the paper on the desk. No smile graced her features, nor did she instinctively reach out for William's hand. The sheer silence in the room spoke volumes, heavy with the gravity of what Buckingham Palace had just set in motion. She was being explicitly recognized and installed as the crown's chosen future queen, carrying immediate upgrades to her ceremonial precedence and her practical grooming for the throne. Ceremonial precedence acts as the rigid, traditional hierarchy dictating precisely where senior royals are positioned, how they make their entrances, and the level of deference they command at state functions. This was far from a mere superficial tweak to her title. It fundamentally dragged her future destiny into the epicenter of her present reality. Throughout this quiet moment, William observed her with intense focus, acutely aware of the silent burdens that public jubilation would inevitably overlook. For years, she had stood as the anchor beside the direct heir to the throne, bearing immense pressures, weathering unending public dissection, and serving as the crucial bridge of continuity between the reigning monarch and the era waiting in the wings. The Prince of Wales recognized this statement as the ultimate validation of everything she had endured and mastered. However, he was equally aware that this validation anchored them both to a set of inescapable lifelong obligations. When her eyes finally met his, her gaze was a complex tapestry of profound pride, quiet trepidation, and a much deeper, resonant sense of surrender to her fate. King Charles had meticulously scrutinized the draft's phrasing before granting his royal seal of approval. The sovereign had explicitly vetoed any watered-down terminology, determined to leave absolutely zero ambiguity regarding where the institution's ultimate, long-term faith was being anchored. The finalized bulletin framed Catherine not simply as the wife of the heir apparent, but as an indispensable pillar essential for safeguarding the monarchy's stability in the forthcoming era. This deliberate choice of phrasing was monumental, as institutional power within the royal family is heavily predicated upon inner access, strategic grooming, heightened visibility, and physical proximity to tomorrow's sovereign, long before any coronation takes place. After letting the reality settle, Catherine carefully folded the document and voiced a single, subdued inquiry regarding the timeline of the public release. William responded immediately, confirming that the world would know imminently. She offered a slight nod. However, the atmosphere was devoid of triumph. Instead, it carried an aura of absolute finality. Both of them knew intrinsically that the comfortable, familiar boundaries of their previous royal existence had been permanently erased. Meanwhile, deep within another wing of the royal estate, those exact same words were being digested with a distinctly frostier realization. One specific individual grasped instantly that by fortifying the monarchy's future, Catherine's newly minted status had subtly, yet undeniably, disrupted the existing power dynamics of the present day. To external observers, an elevated royal status appears as a glittering prize. Yet within the complicated web of the family, it can often serve as a quiet but potent warning. The formal elevation of the Princess of Wales sent immediate shockwaves through the lives of four key figures: Catherine herself, William, Charles, and Camilla. Each of them processed the bulletin through a vastly different lens, depending on where they currently stood on the unrelenting continuum of royal history. For Catherine, it symbolized her ultimate destiny, pulling her directly into its orbit. For William, it was a stark crystallization of his impending sovereign burdens. For Charles, it was the raw machinery of succession at work. And for Camilla, it manifested as something far more confronting, a highly visible, undeniable indicator that every sovereign's era is strictly finite. Catherine lingered in thoughtful silence long after the initial jolt of the news had dissipated. A grueling marathon of public service, intense domestic stress, overarching family obligations, and shadowing William had culminated in this very milestone. Yet the palace's formal decree abruptly stripped away any remaining armor of privacy. The Princess of Wales was no longer allowed the luxury of slowly evolving into her eventual destiny. The institution had just spotlighted her on the global stage as the absolute linchpin of the monarchy's next phase. Consequently, every single public engagement, every sartorial choice, and every inevitable misstep would henceforth be ruthlessly analyzed through the demanding, unforgiving lens of her impending queenship. Sensing the weight descending upon her, William sought her out in a quiet room, softly assuring her that their personal dynamic did not have to transform overnight. She held his gaze for a long moment before quietly rebutting that the transformation had already happened. The global public would now project immense historical significance onto daily actions that previously seemed wonderfully mundane. The prince grasped her meaning instantly. He had fought hard for the palace to publicly acknowledge the massive institutional load she was already shouldering. Yet that very acknowledgement birthed a new, suffocating pressure, and he watched that harsh reality envelop her much swifter than either had anticipated. From an entirely different vantage point, Camilla absorbed the shockwaves of the exact same press release. Her eyes lingered over the specific paragraph detailing Catherine's amplified future significance, and she eventually set the document aside without uttering a single syllable. The Queen Consort was intimately familiar with the mechanics of ceremonial succession, the subtle, orchestrated conditioning of the populace to embrace the figures destined to anchor the subsequent reign. She possessed a crystal-clear understanding of what the king's robust, definitive vocabulary truly signaled. The spotlight was already beginning its slow, inevitable pivot toward tomorrow. While her own sovereign status remained fiercely protected and entirely secure, the underlying truth was inescapable. The institution of the monarchy had just officially commenced the long process of acclimatizing the nation to the reign of another woman. King Charles found himself navigating perhaps the most intricate and emotionally taxing tightrope of all. Prior to the statement's publication, he had engaged in deep, strategic dialogues with his eldest son regarding the necessary expansion of Catherine's portfolio. He had been incredibly careful to isolate Catherine from the final arbitration process, shielding her from any potential whispering that she was aggressively maneuvering for her own promotion. The sovereign was actively laying the groundwork for his heir and daughter-in-law to eventually shoulder a colossal institution that he currently bore alone. This required him to compartmentalize his mind, operating simultaneously as a ruthless constitutional monarch and a protective father. William had offered his consent to the plan, but it was anchored to one non-negotiable ultimatum. Catherine's promotion could not be a hollow, superficial gesture. If the inner workings of the palace expected his wife to seamlessly embody the crushing expectations of a future queen, she fundamentally required unfiltered, authentic access to the high-level strategy sessions that were actively molding that very future. Charles absorbed this ultimatum with profound seriousness, fully aware that William's demand had not materialized out of thin air. To trace the true origins of the palace's sudden decisive action, one must rewind to a specific evening months prior, a seemingly routine royal function that unexpectedly mutated into a definitive point of no return. In the long, sweeping arc of royal history, critical turning points often masquerade as entirely mundane events until the dust finally settles. In this particular saga, the catalyst occurred during a deeply private, closed-door dinner hosted at Windsor Castle, several months before the public was informed of Catherine's ascension. The environment was devoid of the flashing bulbs of the press or the roars of the public. The attendees consisted solely of inner-circle family members and top-tier senior courtiers. The evening's agenda was a pragmatic discussion regarding the trajectory of the monarchy. Yet, a single, tense interaction permanently altered the internal climate. By the time the plates were cleared, William had forged a relentless, unyielding conviction that he outright refused to compromise on. It was morally and practically unjustifiable for Catherine to shoulder the immense psychological burdens of a future queen without being granted the corresponding, tangible authority. When William arrived at the Windsor gathering, he anticipated a complex logistical debate, but certainly not a watershed moment in his marriage and royal career. The primary objective of the evening was to meticulously carve up impending royal obligations, charitable patronages, international diplomatic tours, and institutional duties, dividing them sensibly between Charles's active reign and the younger generation waiting patiently in the wings. These granular logistical choices carry massive constitutional weight, as they dictate precisely who is given the platform to forge crucial diplomatic relationships, shoulder the hopes of the public, and amass the requisite leadership experience before the inevitable transfer of power alters the landscape entirely. Up until this point, Catherine had dedicated years to absorbing staggering levels of public pressure, all while painstakingly ensuring she never appeared to be deliberately eclipsing or competing with the senior-most figures of the blood family. As the Windsor dinner progressed, the dialogue waded deeper into the murky waters of long-term strategic forecasting. and Catherine's internal discomfort began to calcify into something undeniable. Choices that would directly dictate the parameters of the sovereign role she was destined to inhabit were being actively debated all around her. And yet, her own voice and standing within that very debate were left painfully ambiguous. Long-term royal planning is the highly sensitive, behind-closed-doors orchestration of future constitutional duties, diplomatic alliances, traditional ceremonies, and sovereign responsibilities that will inevitably bridge the gap into the next monarch's era. Catherine maintained a flawless mask of composure, yet William instantly detected the subtle shift in her demeanor. The prince intuitively realized that her legendary stoicism was rapidly deteriorating, transforming from a badge of dignified duty into a painful symbol of institutional exclusion. Ultimately, it was a directive from King Charles himself that shattered the fragile peace of the evening. The sovereign politely requested that Catherine excuse herself from the room before the most highly classified and sensitive segments of the strategic transition were discussed exclusively with William and the senior aides. Catherine stood up gracefully, offering zero resistance or complaint. The king fully anticipated that his heir would remain seated to continue the business of state. Instead, William pushed his chair back and stood up as well. That singular, silent, physical action conveyed infinitely more defiance than any screamed argument ever could. He deliberately shadowed Catherine out of the dining room, abandoning Charles and his bewildered advisors, rendering his stance brilliantly, unavoidably clear. In the quiet, tense hours that followed that night, a private summit occurred between father and son. The Prince of Wales kept his simmering frustration tightly leashed, but he refused to dilute the severity of his ultimatum. He made it abundantly clear that expecting his wife to quietly absorb the staggering emotional and psychological toll of impending queenship, while systematically locking her out of the rooms where meaningful preparation actually happened, was a paradigm he would no longer tolerate. Charles absorbed the critique in total silence, offering no defensive interruptions. William articulated that if the institution genuinely expected Catherine to stand as his equal partner at the very zenith of the monarchy, she fundamentally had to be treated as an architect of its future, rather than just a decorative bystander. The reigning monarch offered no definitive ruling that night, and the suffocating silence that hung between the two men felt substantially more oppressive than the verbal confrontation that preceded it. Several tense weeks elapsed before the king finally made his next move. A formal summons was dispatched. William and Catherine were jointly requested to attend a deeply private audience with the king. Crucially, this time the room would be entirely devoid of advisors, aides, or courtiers who typically absorb the friction between family members. The awkward Windsor dinner had ripped the bandage off the underlying dysfunction. This subsequent private audience would force all the lingering, unspoken resentments directly out into the blinding light. For over a decade, Catherine had perfected the most grueling discipline required of a modern royal, mastering the art of saying far less than the public clamored for. Yet when the heavy oak doors finally clicked shut, leaving only the king, the prince, and the princess in the room, her legendary restraint finally fractured. It did not shatter into a display of petty anger or entitled demands, but rather into something vastly more formidable, absolute, piercing clarity. She did not request a glittering new tiara, enhanced financial privileges, or public adoration. She simply looked the monarch in the eye and asked whether the institution genuinely intended to properly equip her for its future, or if it merely required her to stand silently and look appropriately regal in the photographs. Because there were no courtiers present to dictate the flow of conversation, Charles sat back and simply listened. The sovereign had orchestrated this incredibly intimate gathering because the deep fractures exposed during the Windsor dinner were no longer sustainable. This was especially true given that Catherine's forward-facing, public duties were expanding at a relentless pace, even as her behind-the-scenes access to the monarchy's long-range strategic blueprint remained severely bottlenecked. The concept of succession preparation is a slow, methodical osmosis, a prolonged process through which future monarchs and their chosen consorts intimately learn the diplomatic ropes, forge vital relationships, internalize ancient traditions, and grasp the colossal state machinery they will one day command. For the Princess of Wales, this lack of preparation had morphed into a deeply personal slight. The palace demanded that she project a flawless aura of seamless continuity to the global public, yet repeatedly barred her from crossing the threshold into the very rooms where that continuity was being meticulously engineered. Meeting the king's gaze with unwavering, controlled intensity, Catherine laid bare her boundaries. She was fully prepared to endure the microscopic scrutiny of the press. She was willing to make the necessary personal sacrifices. She could carry the crushing weight of a nation's expectations. What she could not and would not do was pretend to adequately prepare for her eventual queenship while being forced to remain mute whenever the architects of the crown mapped out that very future. Instinctively, William leaned forward, preparing to interject and lend his considerable weight to her argument, but Catherine gently reached out and rested a hand on his arm, silently halting him. The prince retreated instantly. He recognized that this specific battle belonged entirely to her, and she was determined to use her own voice to fight it. Eventually, Charles exhaled and confessed the root cause of his persistent hesitation. He possessed a long, painful memory of how rapidly royal households could splinter into warring factions whenever the roles of the future guard appeared to encroach upon or threaten the ultimate authority of the current sovereign. The king had purposefully dictated a glacial pace for her integration because he was terrified of accidentally cultivating rival power bases, fostering internal friction, and breeding deep-seated resentment long before the actual transfer of power was required. However, Catherine countered his fears with a devastatingly accurate observation that he found impossible to refute. Artificially restricting her authority and leaving her boundaries ambiguous was precisely what was currently generating the toxic competition he feared. By keeping her status vague, the vacuum of power allowed ambitious courtiers, private secretaries, and even other family members to arbitrarily dictate where her jurisdiction started and stopped. A profound hush blanketed the room. William kept his eyes locked on his father, desperately trying to gauge if Catherine's arrow had found its mark. Catherine, having delivered her unvarnished truth, refused to push the matter any further. She had articulated exactly what needed to be said, and Charles finally grasped that her plea was entirely devoid of blind, grasping ambition. It was rooted purely in a desperate need for adequate preparation, mutual trust, and a fundamental desire to see the monarchy align its crushing expectations with genuine structural inclusion. The king officially concluded the summit without granting them a concrete resolution. Yet, after the Prince and Princess of Wales had departed the room, Charles did not immediately return to his daily schedule. Instead, he summoned a highly classified, sealed succession dossier to his desk. Catherine had finally laid her cards on the table, but the ultimate verdict now rested entirely on what the sovereign discovered hidden deep within the bureaucratic framework of the crown itself. The most monumental shifts in royal history are almost never decided under the glow of crystal chandeliers or before cheering crowds. They are painstakingly forged in the margins of confidential dossiers, through the leveraging of ancient precedents, during hushed conversations, and ultimately by a single stroke of a pen placed where historians will one day uncover it. King Charles was now staring down a dilemma with ramifications extending far beyond Catherine's personal career trajectory. If he explicitly fortified her institutional standing, he would simultaneously hit the accelerator on the monarchy's inevitable transition toward William's era. Conversely, if he denied her request, he flirted with the disastrous possibility of leaving the nation's future queen publicly adored, but fundamentally, dangerously unequipped to rule. And the aging king was acutely aware that the relentless march of time, rather than family sentiment, would ultimately force his hand. Opening the heavy succession file, Charles systematically evaluated every constitutional lever at his disposal. He possessed the power to radically upgrade Catherine's ceremonial precedence, grant her unrestricted security clearance to the Crown's long-term strategic briefings, aggressively expand her diplomatic portfolio on the global stage, and embed her deeply into the institution's master planning committee, all without legally transferring a single ounce of his own sovereign power. Ceremonial precedence may appear to the outside world as a purely technical, esoteric ranking system detailing exactly where senior royals stand at banquets or state funerals, but within the palace walls, its implications are profoundly intimate and strictly enforced. Any upward adjustment would send a blindingly clear signal to the sprawling palace staff that her impending queenship was no longer a distant theoretical concept, but an active, present-day reality. The king sat silently as his top constitutional advisors meticulously outlined that authentic royal influence is rarely achieved through the sudden bestowal of a shiny new title. True, unshakable influence is organically cultivated through consistent, direct access to the reigning monarch, rigorous immersion into constitutional affairs, flawless execution of global representation, and an undisputed seat at the table during highly sensitive succession dialogues. When the aides finally bowed and retreated, leaving the king in solitude, Charles removed his reading glasses and simply stared into the middle distance. He understood that adequately prepping William and Catherine was the only viable method to safeguard the crown's continuity. Yet, embracing that preparation required him to mentally and emotionally confront a future landscape where his own reign was a closed chapter. Later that evening, Camilla instantly sensed the heavy, invisible burden resting on her husband's shoulders. In the privacy of their quarters, she gently questioned whether this structural transition truly necessitated such a glaringly public declaration. The queen consort was deeply attuned to the internal shockwaves that elevated, commanding vocabulary regarding Catherine would trigger, not just across the nation, but within the fiercely territorial inner sanctums of every competing royal household. Charles did not wave away her anxieties. He acknowledged them fully. However, he softly replied that artificially stalling the future would do absolutely nothing to secure the stability of the present. While maintaining the status quo of silence might offer a temporary illusion of peace, the creeping rot of uncertainty had already started fracturing the family from within. Returning to the decisive file, Charles made his ultimate ruling. The forthcoming palace dispatch would be deliberately weaponized with elevated, undeniable language explicitly cementing Catherine's status, ensuring that absolutely no courtier, journalist, or citizen could misinterpret the new trajectory of royal authority. Furthermore, and vastly more significant behind the scenes, he officially sanctioned her immediate, unfettered access to the highest echelons of the Crown's future planning committees. This was emphatically not a superficial PR exercise in ceremonial flattery. It was a tangible, irreversible reallocation of institutional access, classified knowledge, and raw power. As the king laid down his fountain pen, having applied his signature to the decree, the die was cast. Camilla instinctively knew the landscape had shifted. William would soon feel the undeniable change in the tides, and Catherine, who had risked everything merely to request honest, practical training for her inescapable destiny, was about to realize that her courageous stand had rewritten far more than just a few lines in a palace press release. While the king's signature legally resolved the dispute on parchment, the dawning of the very first morning under this newly forged hierarchy violently exposed exactly what it meant in practical, breathing reality. The genius of the shift lay in its subtlety. There were no dramatic fireworks, no courtiers were unceremoniously fired, nor were grand palace doors slammed in fury. It was precisely this eerie, seamless quiet that made the transition feel so monumentally potent. A highly classified briefing document suddenly materialized on Catherine's private desk. A pivotal strategy meeting invitation now prominently featured her name in the required attendees list. A seasoned advisor who previously would have routed a critical inquiry through a different chain of command now walked directly to the Princess of Wales for a definitive ruling. These were microscopic, bureaucratic pivots, practically invisible to the outside world, yet they served as an ear-splitting siren within the claustrophobic corridors of the royal household. Catherine was no longer being politely managed from the fringes of the institution. She had been firmly, irrevocably dragged into the blistering heat of its core. When the first deeply expanded, heavily classified briefing pack was delivered to her, Catherine stared at the sealed folder, leaving it untouched for several long minutes. Contained within those pages were the highly sensitive architectural blueprints for long-term royal strategy, complex Commonwealth engagement schedules, meticulous protocols for ceremonial continuity, and the sprawling, staggering responsibilities inherently tethered to the future reign. Commonwealth engagements, in particular, are incredibly delicate official duties involving dozens of global nations that maintain historical ties with the British Crown, requiring exhaustive, nuanced diplomacy to navigate beautifully diverse cultures and frequently shifting political governments. She had waged a fierce, emotionally draining battle to secure her rightful seat at the table where her future was being written. Yet now, staring at the physical manifestation of that victory, the crushing gravity of it threatened to steal her breath. The abstract concept of royal responsibility the seismic instantly mutated daily reality, a terrifyingly concrete reality. His own dedicated household staff and his father's notoriously protective senior aides were suddenly executing a level of synchronized coordination that was previously unimaginable. They were actively cross-pollinating schedules, aligning long-term strategic priorities, and freely exchanging classified information that had historically been jealously guarded and segregated between the reigning generation and the heirs. The prince grasped precisely why this unprecedented transparency was vital. If the monarchy had any hope of surviving the eventual traumatic shock of a sovereign transition, the individuals tasked with steering the ship through the storm absolutely needed to understand the mechanics of the engine room long before they were handed the wheel. Yet simultaneously, he watched with a growing sense of unease as Catherine's fiercely guarded slivers of private, normal life were systematically eradicated under the crushing weight of her new inescapable mandate. Camilla experienced the new reality firsthand when she entered a routine scheduling summit, fully anticipating the standard, familiar power dynamics, only to be confronted by an immediate, undeniable shift in the room's atmosphere. Catherine was already present, seated purposefully among the inner circle, receiving the most highly classified, forward-looking transition materials. The Queen Consort maintained a mask of total, unbothered composure, yet her verbal contributions became noticeably more clipped and abbreviated whenever the conversation pivoted toward future, long-term ceremonial obligations. Absolutely no one in the room overtly challenged Camilla's authority, largely because it was entirely unnecessary. The shift in power was silently, painfully obvious merely by observing who was now being actively courted for opinions in discussions that until recently had been the exclusive domain of the current reign. For William, the most jarring confirmation of the New World Order arrived a few days later during a hushed, private briefing with a senior aide. He was explicitly informed that Catherine's new integration would absolutely not be limited to passively reading briefing documents. Moving forward, her counsel would be actively sought and heavily weighted regarding permanent, structural decisions that would inevitably bleed into his own future reign. The future king had drawn a line in the sand following the Windsor incident, demanding meaningful inclusion for his wife, and the machinery of the palace had capitulated entirely, giving him exactly what he had asked for. Yet this total victory left him feeling deeply unsettled. He had successfully shielded her from the indignity of exclusion, but in doing so, he had personally unlocked a door to a tidal wave needing to confront the reality of their new existence. Ever be closed William again. Sought Catherine out, deliberately leaving behind his aides the endless briefing files and the suffocating daily schedules. While the institution possessed the power to dictate Catherine's future trajectory using polished, official vocabulary, only William and Catherine possessed the agency to determine what this elevated destiny would ultimately cost their own souls. For a fleeting moment, they were entirely free from the relentless grinding machinery of the palace. There were no whispering advisors, no meticulously curated talking points, and no cameras. They were simply a husband and a wife, standing face to face with the towering, intimidating reality of what their victory had actually wrought. They had gone to war to ensure she was respected as a legitimate, formidable future queen. Now that the crown had bowed to their demands, the triumph felt surprisingly suffocating. It takes only seconds for a grand title to be proclaimed to the world, but successfully surviving the crushing, lifelong expectations shackled to that title is an ordeal that consumes entire decades. William desperately needed one raw, unfiltered evening where they weren't forced to carefully calibrate every single syllable. He needed to excavate exactly what Catherine was experiencing beneath the flawless, rehearsed veneer she was required to project to the world. The brutal machinery of succession preparation had already begun devouring their daily routines. This was not a trivial shift. It equated to a massive surge in state obligations, an exponential increase in media scrutiny, and a devastating reduction in those rare, precious hours where they could simply exist as parents, as romantic partners, or as anonymous human beings. The prince had aggressively championed her right to sit at the table, but now he was forced to watch as that hard-won inclusion rapidly calcified into an exhausting, endless series of ironclad obligations. In the quiet of their private sanctuary, Catherine finally gave voice to a profound, chilling fear she had previously kept buried. For years, her primary anxiety had been whether the ancient institution would ever truly respect her enough to weave her into the authentic fabric of its future. Now, having conquered that mountain, she was plagued by an entirely new terror. She confessed a deep-seated dread that the crown's insatiable appetite would continually demand more and more of her, until the core, authentic pieces of her humanity were permanently swallowed by the unforgiving demands of duty. She was terrified of slowly transforming into an impossibly polished, hollow symbol, a flawless porcelain figure with absolutely nothing human left breathing beneath the surface. William absorbed her fears without a shred of defensiveness. He didn't try to justify his actions. He simply admitted that he had backed the king into a corner because the agony of watching her shoulder the paralyzing expectations of a queen, while being denied the tools to survive it, had completely broken his heart. The future sovereign passionately believed that the woman destined to share his throne inherently deserved a powerful, undeniable voice in shaping the colossal burdens they would carry together. Yet he also possessed the courage to stare into the abyss and acknowledge the brutal, undeniable truth. His aggressive intervention had permanently dragged her under the most blinding, unforgiving spotlight on earth, and it would be cowardly to pretend otherwise. Catherine processed his words and quietly, resolutely cemented her path forward. She would not back down. She would accept the vastly expanded portfolio. She would bravely endure the microscopic, relentless public dissection, the grueling preparation, and the terrifying responsibility that accompanied her victory. However, she adamantly refused to become a tragic, fading echo of the royal women who had buckled under similar, crushing burdens in the past. She was determined to aggressively mold this terrifying new role around her own core values of honesty, the sanctity of her immediate family, and a fiercely protected sense of self that could somehow survive the suffocating grip of the institution, rather than being slowly digested by it. In response, William offered her a solemn, unbreakable vow. He promised that when the heavy, ancient crown eventually fell to their generation, their reign would not draw its power from the archaic tradition of pretending that royal sacrifice leaves no scars. Instead, their strength would be forged by fiercely guarding enough genuine humanity and warmth within the icy walls of the monarchy to ensure they could survive the agonizing costs of the crown together. Their deeply intimate confrontation concluded not with joyous celebration, but with a profound, steely resolve. And outside the fortress of privacy they had fought so desperately to protect, the nation was already busy mutating Catherine's internal victory into a massive, symbolic cultural phenomenon. What had started as a tense, private power struggle within the gilded cage of the royal family was rapidly snowballing into a massive public referendum on the exact type of monarchy the British people desired for their future. By the time the sun breached the horizon the following morning, the palace's painstakingly drafted statement belonged entirely to the public domain. Frenzied television panels aggressively dissected every single syllable. The national newspapers printed the words in towering, bold fonts. Throngs of royalists excitedly echoed the phrasing outside the wrought iron gates of the estates. Catherine's deeply private, grueling acceptance of her monumental destiny had been instantly co-opted as a national symbol of reassuring transition. Many citizens viewed the elevation as a deeply comforting maneuver, a beloved, familiar figure being wisely and steadily readied for the crown's inevitable next volume. Others, however, perceived a much more profound narrative playing out. They saw an ancient institution quietly but ruthlessly marching toward the future, even as the current king's reign was still actively being written. But amidst the avalanche of commentary, one specific visual managed to perfectly distill the overwhelming gravity of the historical pivot. Catherine allowed herself to observe a brief segment of the relentless morning broadcast coverage before decisively silencing the television. Pundits and anchors were universally declaring the Palace Dispatch as the most concrete, undeniable proof to date that she was destined to stand as the undisputed bedrock of the monarchy's next epoch alongside William. The weighty phrase "future queen" had been permanently stripped of its speculative, distant aura. It was now an active, foundational pillar of the daily national discourse. For Catherine, witnessing this was deeply jarring and profoundly unsettling. She was sitting in her living room, listening to total strangers forcefully narrate a monumentally powerful historical version of herself that she was still actively, painfully trying to grow into. King Charles navigated the tidal wave of public reaction through a completely different emotional spectrum. The monarch looked upon the soaring public approval with a mixture of deep paternal pride, genuine excitement for the institution's security, and a sigh of profound relief. Yet he was simultaneously burdened by the inescapable melancholic undertones that forever shadow the concept of royal succession. Succession is the brutal, beautiful, unrelenting machinery by which the ultimate power of the crown is ripped from one fading era and bestowed upon the next, permanently shifting the global center of gravity. Every single cheer, every flag waved in support of Catherine and William's readiness, served as a deafening, unavoidable reminder to the king that his subjects were already eagerly visualizing a world where he was no longer their sovereign. He swelled with pride at their undeniable competence, but he also harbored the quiet, solitary heartbreak of a father and a ruler who is forced to actively facilitate his own obsolescence in the name of historical continuity. The narrative exploded to an entirely new level of intensity when a prominent national newspaper hit the stands featuring a visually stunning, stark front page. A solitary, powerful portrait of Catherine anchored beneath the commanding, absolute headline, "The Queen to Come." That single, masterful piece of journalism instantly mutated the entire tone of the day. What had originated as a dry, technical reallocation of palace duties suddenly possessed the emotional resonance of a sweeping national manifesto. The chattering classes entirely ceased debating the mere logistics of her expanding schedule and aggressively pivoted to deeply philosophical arguments regarding the specific brand of sovereign she was destined to become. Meanwhile, beyond the imposing facades of Buckingham Palace, the emotional response from the public was becoming strikingly intimate. As the news saturated the airwaves, citizens began flocking to the gates, and amidst the sea of standard Union Jacks and hastily scrawled well-wishes, one particular poignant placard pierced through the noise: "Ready when history calls." This powerful six-word phrase was eagerly seized upon by evening news producers and repeated endlessly, primarily because it perfectly encapsulated the dizzying paradox of Catherine's new reality. It reflected the nation's soaring admiration for her breathtaking ascent, but it also acknowledged the terrifying, crushing anvil of duty now suspended directly over her head. When Catherine was eventually informed of the sign's existence, she offered no celebratory reaction. She simply absorbed the profound truth it represented. The British public had wholeheartedly embraced the inevitability of her reign far faster than the fragile, complicated human beings inside the family had managed to emotionally process it. And when the frenzied headlines inevitably began to recede into the archives, the true, lasting ramifications of the decree settled permanently into the bones of the palace, where every single player in the drama had been fundamentally, irreversibly altered by the outcome. The public had rendered its enthusiastic verdict. Now only one lingering mystery required a definitive answer, not concerning the specific wording of Catherine's title, but regarding the ultimate, historical legacy of the entire agonizing struggle. When the dust finally settled, it became abundantly clear that Catherine's hard-fought elevation was never truly about securing a slightly more grandiose title on official letterhead. The entire conflict centered entirely around forcing the ancient institution to cease treating her impending destiny as a mirage, and finally demanding that she be allowed to physically hold the reins of that destiny in the present day. The initial shockwaves of the press release faded into memory. The bitter, hushed arguments in the palace corridors evaporated. The bold newspaper fonts were recycled. What was left standing was a reality of staggering historical consequence. Catherine had deliberately, bravely stepped across an invisible, terrifying threshold. She was no longer a passive passenger hurtling toward a historical inevitability. She had looked the beast in the eye and consciously, willingly signed a contract to become the absolute guardian of it. In the quiet of her office, Catherine reached once more for the exact same highly classified briefing folder that had caused her to hesitate just days prior. This time there was absolutely no pause, no lingering doubt. Her fundamental identity within the sprawling apparatus of the monarchy had metamorphosed from a carefully shielded future consort in training into the universally acknowledged, battle-tested architect of the impending royal epoch. A consort is officially defined as the spouse of a reigning monarch, a figure tasked with sharing the grueling marathon of public duty without wielding the sovereign's absolute constitutional authority. This technical distinction was paramount because it meant her true power would not be derived from an ancient law, but rather from her immaculate preparation, her razor-sharp judgment, the unshakable trust of the people, and the monumental partnership she would eventually forge beside William. After the intoxicating frenzy of the public reaction had thoroughly cooled, Charles requested one final, private audience with her. The aging king looked at his daughter-in-law and imparted a harsh, lonely truth. Ascending the royal ladder almost never feels like a victory to the person climbing it. Every single rung conquered introduces a heavier, more suffocating burden of responsibility, while simultaneously stripping away yet another precious, irreplaceable layer of personal liberty. Catherine absorbed his wisdom with total stillness, and softly replied that she finally, truly comprehended the bargain she had struck. The king had brilliantly engineered the survival of his bloodline by rigorously stress-testing the next generation. Yet he also possessed the heartbreaking wisdom to know that perfectly preparing them equated to quietly accepting that the mighty institution would, inevitably, leave him behind. In her own private quarters, Camilla had slowly arrived at a place of quiet, dignified peace. The queen consort had completely ceased viewing Catherine's meteoric rise as any sort of personal affront or defeat, even though the structural transition had initially sparked undeniable human insecurity. She possessed the hard-earned, bruising wisdom of a woman who knew the monarchy intimately. She understood the brutal, unyielding law of the crown. Every single woman who manages to survive in the blinding proximity of the throne must eventually, inevitably confront the day when the spotlight drifts away to illuminate the youth of the generation following behind her. Her initial apprehension had been entirely valid, but it no longer dictated her emotional reality. A profound, graceful acceptance had permanently extinguished her resistance. As Catherine continued to systematically process the daunting contents of the succession file, William quietly entered the room and posed one final, simple question. He asked if she was truly, finally ready. The prince had learned a brutal, invaluable lesson through the fires of their recent conflict. Successfully navigating the treacherous path to kingship was a suicide mission if attempted in isolation. The ultimate survival of his future reign hinged entirely upon her possessing the requisite knowledge, the unshakable confidence, and the genuine, undeniable authority to rule as his absolute equal. Catherine briefly broke her concentration, looked up at the man she would one day crown, and offered zero theatrical declarations. She simply stated that they had a tremendous amount of work to do. That quiet, resolute sentence was the only answer required. Her ultimate triumph was never truly found in the king's formal wording, the adoring newspaper spreads, or the distant, glittering promise of a sovereign crown. Her true coronation occurred in the exact moment she refused to be shielded from the terrifying avalanche of history waiting for her, and consciously, bravely chose to stand her ground and carry the weight of it anyway. King Charles had successfully fortified the monarchy's continuity. Prince William had secured a formidable, equal partner for the battles ahead. Queen Camilla had gracefully bowed to the relentless momentum of time, and Catherine walked away fundamentally transformed, not because she had vanquished her family members in a petty power struggle, but because she had finally embraced the profound, inescapable truth that extreme royal privilege and devastating personal sacrifice are eternally, inextricably bound together. The crown had ceased being a glittering prize to be coveted. It had finally been recognized for what it truly was, a staggering, terrifying responsibility that must be survived and passed forward. The ultimate choice had been made. The ancient family had absorbed the shockwaves of its consequences, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, had finally accepted the immense historical weight of the future that was patiently waiting for her. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.